hopefully more clear what we're debating. So the proposition that I put forward was, excuse me, the proposition I put forward when I find it, to reject veganism (sentientism) whilst maintaining support for other equality movements such as feminism, racial civil rights, and socialism undermines the ethical foundations required for these movements and is therefore contradictory. And you're rejecting that. So what I'm proposing is that the foundation of all of these movements is equality. That racial civil rights, feminism, and socialism are all based upon the notion that everyone is equal to some degree, at least in terms of having ethical consideration for one another. Racial civil rights and feminism prominently are, occurring right now in terms of Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and so on. Socialism has never stopped, obviously, for the last 100 years, we have labor movements. But veganism is relatively new in terms of its growing popularity. The reason for that is because animals are just being recognized now by many as being equal to other individuals in terms of interests, in terms of moral, in terms of having moral value. Now, that's not that they didn't have it before, it's that they're only just recognizing it. Now, socialism, racial civil rights, and so on, are essentially based on movements based to try and end social injustices which create an unfair, unjust environment for some people to live their lives. And so what these movements attempt to do is to equal ground, so in terms of opportunity, in terms of living standards, and so on, so that individuals are not being discriminated against unjustly, so that they can have a life that is fair and just against other individuals within that society and global communities as a whole. Veganism is no different. It only applies to animals as well. Now, my point is that what we view in terms of value in regards to other people is present within those animals. That animals have the exact same capacity to feel pain and pleasure. Animals have the same ability to have positive and negative experiences, and in such, they are morally valuable. And this cannot be denied. When we recognize that something is morally valuable, what we are recognizing is this capacity to feel pain and pleasure, is this capacity to have interest, is this capacity to try and make decisions and have freedom in themselves, to express their desires in the world and live good lives. So it has nothing to do with skin color. It has nothing to do with gender. It has nothing to do with sex or what class you were born into. It has everything to do with the value that is inherent within the value the value of your experiences, your ability to perceive value and recognize it within the world. And so when I talk about letting you live a good life, I don't mean by my standard. I don't mean by like what I think you're worth or what you think or what I think is a good life for you. What I mean is in respect to your experiences, what will actually bring you happiness, safety, security, and well-being. Now, this is exactly what we care about. And the whole point of these movements is to bring it back to that standard, to bring it back to what actually matters. Now, if that's the goal of the movement, to recognize that there is only one standard that we can judge as being morally relevant, and that is the capacity to feel pain and pleasure, it is the capacity to feel well-being and live a free life, then to reject another being's liberties and another being's sentience, another being's subjectivity on a whim, on a desire that is not only purely selfish, but is justified by gratification, taste, sensation, for example, or personal pleasure. And so when we reject veganism or sentientism on these grounds, we are rejecting equality between the other and ourselves on a grounds for personal gratification, which is exactly what occurs when people are racist or sexist or ultimately prejudiced against people's social class. And that's why I think it is a contradiction. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Is that that's your opening statement?
Yeah, that's my opening statement.
Okay. Well, thank you. So I think firstly, I just want to get on the record that I'm not anti-vegan per se. I think you can make a reasonable case for veganism. I just don't think you can make a moral case based on sentientism. But before we get into it, I think we should probably clarify some of the terminology we're using so we're just on the same page.
Of course.
So by sentience, would you give me your description or definition of sentience?
So I would say sentience is ability to have a value response within the world, subjectivity itself, conscious awareness of one's emotional, a conscious experience of including emotional stimuli. So like value, pain, pleasure, positive, negative, phenomenological experience.
Okay, yeah. I think I can agree with that. And we can use the term sentience interchangeably with consciousness. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I would say so. I think in the sense that I'm yet to see something that is conscious yet not sentient, but I think people argue that computers could possibly go that way.
Yeah, okay. And by veganism, I suppose we're using the Vegan Society definition, right?
Yeah, I'm using the Vegan Society definition.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can I check what you consider to be exploitation? For example, I presume you would consider the breeding of animals into existence for the sole purpose of meat consumption to be exploitation. But would you consider the use of animals for any purpose, such as some form of labor, like dogs used in police work or in rescue work?
Yeah, so I would say that exploitation is to use another as a means to an end. Take a Kantian definition as that, to deny another's interests in respect to your own, so not to treat someone as equal to yourself or having
Right.
equal value.
Okay, so that would include then using animals for any purpose, right? So dogs.
Any purpose where they're not being treated fairly. So you could have an animal and have a symbiotic relationship with an animal. You could have an animal and treat them fairly, and they could still perform a task.
Right. Okay. So, for example, police dogs wouldn't necessarily be anti-vegan in your view.
Not necessarily. I think you could have
And
police
using
dogs
horses for transport, that sort of thing, wouldn't necessarily be
horses for
anti-vegan.
transport would usually be against everything I stand for, yeah, because it normally harms the horses. It's very rare that it doesn't harm the horses. And also they become like distressed. There's also the psychological idea of having to quote unquote break a horse. There's a lot that goes into like horses and horse riding and stuff that's different from necessarily like having a dog. I would say that at the same time with police dogs, ultimately I think that I would rather police dogs didn't exist. I think that the overall damage to the dog can be considerable because they can get shot, they can get hurt, and at the end of the day, they're not consenting to that because they're incapable of it. But also the risk reward ratio to the dog is they're being normally treated as more expendable than an individual. That they're normally sending the dogs in because they wouldn't send a human in that place, and I think that's wrong.
Okay, I would just push back on that term consent because I don't think an animal can consent to anything, can they? So
that's what I'm saying. Like that's one of the. It's not about that lack of consent in the sense that I know they can't consent. The whole point of what I'm saying is that it's not as if they're consciously aware of the risks that are being undertaken, and it's not whether and at the same time they're not able to stand up to an authority and say this is unfair. You're putting me in a dangerous situation without like proper safety protocols like a human would, like with PPE and health and safety standards.
Yeah. Okay. So if we take away the risk element to it and say we use guide dogs, would that be anti-vegan? Guide dogs.
Not necessarily, but I do think that the breeding of dogs is usually an issue, and also the fact like what happens to the dog after it's being trained and then it's too old to do the job.
Yeah. Okay. And just a couple more, so we're on the same page. Pets in general.
Pets can be okay, yeah, as long as it's you're treating them fairly.
Okay. And cows for milk production.
Absolutely not, no, because to produce milk, you've got to not one. I think the industry itself will always have to kill the animals because to be profitable. Two, the production of milk requires the sexual exploitation of the cow. They need to be forcibly impregnated. Then the calf needs to be removed so that the milk can be then taken from the mother, because otherwise there wouldn't be enough milk for humans to drink. The calves are usually either killed if they're male at birth or a few days later, and if they're not, then they're raised for beef anyway, and they're going to die. But it's very rare that they're raised for veal. Sorry. typically in the UK because of against veal, atypically, and then the females are raised for dairy a lot of the time. So and go through the same levels of exploitation, and normally treated horribly, kept in cramped environments, have to be pumped full of antibiotics, have loads of infection rates, genuinely treated very horribly. And then at the end of that, about a 5-year stint of being sexually abused, hurt, and continuously exploited, they are then sent to slaughter.
So you're generally referring to current factory farm methods there, but are there circumstances where you think cows can be milked in an ethical manner, for example?
Yet to see anything ethical about milking, no.
Right. Okay. So there's something, but is it a form of exploitation per se to take milk from a cow and drink it when you don't have to?
No, I wouldn't say it's the actual milking is the exploitation. I mean, if the cow finds it uncomfortable, if the cow, if there wasn't a calf, like for whatever reason, let's say there wasn't a calf there, the cow needed to be milked because the calf died, and someone was to drink it because they were doing the cow a favor. The cow's going to live a life longer than it needs to, longer than it needs to produce milk for. So, like after 5 years, if it's spent, it still keeps living regardless of its ability to produce milk. They're not going to forcefully impregnate the cow again. They're not going to keep it in cramped environments. It's basically there was a pregnant cow where the calf died at a sanctuary or something like that, and it needs to be milked for its own well-being. Do I think that you're wrong for drinking that milk? Well, no, it's just going to get thrown down the drain anyway, otherwise. So there's no real issue there. The real issue comes down to the exploitation of the animal, like actually harming the animal.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But what I was sort of hinting at was, for example, so-called ethical farms like ahimsa farms. Also, if we think historically in the Indian subcontinent, where cow breeding and milk consumption has been a big part of their diet, yet they try to do it as much of a ethical and considerate manner as possible. They have
They are the largest exporters of beef in the world, though.
Well, now I mean I'm talking historically. So for example, India obviously was under Jainism and Buddhism for 1,000 years. Jainism is founded on the principle of ahimsa, non-violence to animals, to the point where Jainism actually advocates sweeping the floor in front of them as they walk, isn't it, so that they don't step on and kill insects. Yet milk consumption was still a big part of their way of life, and they saw it as
But then many Jainists now are vegan. But I think that people used to think that you needed milk consumption to survive. You needed to eat meat, dairy, and eggs to survive. And I think people used to believe that, for one. I think also, from what I've seen, there is no ethical production of meat, dairy, or eggs. Primarily because it's, one, not profitable, but two, it's to obtain the milk, you've either got, I mean, unless you're allowing the cows to breed naturally, even then, like the calf will drink the milk. So I've never seen a way that you could obtain milk, drink it, and it not be exploitative, unless it was like some freak accident.
Yeah, so because essentially what I'm getting at, I'm asking you the question: is it possible? I mean, not using current industry standards, but is it possible in your mind to have ethical milk production on a wide scale? And you would argue, no, it's not.
No, it's not.
Okay, so I think we do have fundamental differences there, which we can work with, because I'm not really going to argue for the meat consumption, eating meat as such, but we've got some differences there where I think we can, have a productive disagreement. So I guess I'll start by saying, I mean, well, firstly, I picked up a couple of things in your opening statement. You said animals have equal moral value. So I think I would probably push back on that and argue against that point. And also you said that animals have the exact same capacity for pain and pleasure. And
I don't mean the exact same capacity in the sense that I can't tell you what the hard problem of consciousness, because I can't say if you've got the exact same capacity for pain and pleasure. And I would say that there is phenomenological difference with the application of language, which changes our experiences in many ways. But I'll clarify that later on.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, those are probably 2 points which I would want to explore a little bit more. But my primary argument would be that I don't think it's contradictory to be a human rights activist and support movements like racial equality or feminism and be a non-vegan, because I think those movements are primarily based in speciesism and not sentientism, right? So I think they're primarily based in the idea that all human beings are equal and all human beings should be treated equal, but they're not based in the idea that all sentient organisms are equal, or rather, all sentient species are equal.
I mean, there could be to the limits of equality, but that doesn't mean that the contradiction isn't occurring. It just means that they're not aware of it.
Well, they're basing their moral framework, their metaphysical grounding is different, isn't it, to yours in
It
that
is.
case?
It's different, and I can accept that. Except I would say that they haven't properly applied reason. Otherwise, they would come to the conclusion that sentientism is true, and therefore the
Yeah.
consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs is unjustified based off their own notions of equality, which they've agreed with. They accept equality, and therefore, which is implicit within their actions and political movements.
Yeah, so I think we're going to sort of descend here into a debate, an argument on sentientism versus speciesism. So, would you like to give your defense
So,
for sentientism?
so sentientism, my understanding of sentientism is the moral consideration of all sentient beings. And it is essentially the foundation of ethics as being related to subjectivity. It's been around for a long time, actually. I mean, a lot of Buddhists are sentientists. As you say, Jainists, a lot of them are sentientists. Speciesism, on the other hand, is the form of exploitation. It's a form of prejudice. The argument that the argument for speciesism is that that treating an animal different to another animal in terms of moral value based on no other grounds but their species is unjustified.
Right, but when you say that's unjustified, many people will justify it, won't they? They can justify speciesism because they can appeal to theistic morality, for example. And in most
They can appeal
theistic
to it,
moral
doesn't make it
codes, there is this
justified.
distinction made between animals and humans, and the moral code is for humans and not for
Okay.
animals. So, for
Okay,
example,
so
"Thou shalt not murder" is, it's implied that thou shalt not murder humans, not thou shalt not murder animals.
and Jesus is eating fish, and but Jesus is also around at the time of slavery, and he doesn't seem to do much to stop that. I think that
Well,
I think if you're looking at theistic morality, I think that the reality of it is that ever since the Enlightenment, we've come to know that the authority of religion has to be held in check by reason, and that reason alone and its proper application allows us to determine what is right and wrong and good and bad, and that fundamentalism is inherently flawed. So what we have is, when we look at the enlightened religions, is a rejection of fundamentalism, the belief that the religion itself is directly the will of the creator, telling us how to live our lives directly. Like evangelical Christians, for example, we usually think of them as being almost extremists and fundamentally disillusioned.
yeah.
But also, I would say that it's the real argument for this comes from hermeneutics. So the understanding of the word itself is an application of reason. Reason itself allows us to understand how words are used. And so what we see is that the capacity to try and understand something pretty rationally is impossible. And so when we use words like good, bad, right, wrong, murder, murder, killing, blah, 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 all of these words have rational purport to conceptualization of reality, which is prior to religion. And so the proper application of reason is entirely necessary to even interpret the Bible or interpret any other religious scripture. So when we have someone trying to appeal to religious ethics as a justification that is trying to become prior to what I would argue is an objective fact about the world, which is in relation to objective ethics, then they would have to argue that, one, God is prescribing something that is irrational, and two, which I don't think there is a solid argument there that they could do, and two, that that God could be that words are not dependent upon reality, but are instead defined separately by a creator. And I think they would need some sort of like necessary divine revelation that would allow you to understand that prior to learning words. In which case, I just ask them, why can't they read Hebrew and get divine revelation from the original texts?
Mhm. Yeah, well, well, I think the argument is that they do get divine revelation, isn't it? I think that's where they would argue the scriptures come from, and the subsequent moral code that is contained within the scripture. That would be their argument. But the point I'm trying to make is that
It's never like purely divine revelation in the sense that they always have to know the language and understand it. No one ever thinks that they could have the word of God transcribed in their mind pre-linguistically.
uh,
it's usually that when they reflect and look at the words. I mean, most religions now are enlightened anyway. Like that's why you have Bible study, because they have to study the text to understand it. It's not something that instantly becomes aware. I mean, that's why you've got theologians and you've got people who spend their entire lives, and this is the people who teach the religion as well. Priests and other members of the religion are usually heavily informed upon how words would have, what words meant, the culture of the time in which they were written, so on. Like, I mean, like you can go on, I think, like Teachable, and there are a few couple hour long lectures just on like St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, or the Lord's Prayer, and so on, just to understand it, because it's not something that's implicit within it. Like, you don't read the Lord's Prayer and, oh, I completely understand that now. No. And even then, like, even your understanding of the words themselves is an act of reason, which requires multiple people to understand it. Now, I'll just say that the language itself could not be private. So you wouldn't even be able to, like, let's say like you did have this meaning transcribed into your brain by a creator. You wouldn't be able to understand it anyway unless there was a frame of reference between you and another individual, which would allow you to objectify the words and then hold them to a standard. Because otherwise, you could just be absolutely mental. You could be hallucinating. You could be having like a psychotic episode, and you wouldn't even know why, what the words meant, and wouldn't hold them constant. The meaning would shift and change as your memory of the words changes. You'd be relying upon something which is entirely subjective and biased.
Yeah, I can see where you're going with that. I obviously understand the whole language game, the philosophy of language issue, but
Yeah.
the claim from a theist, for example, I'm going to play the theist now, and the claim from them is that they have there is an objective moral code, right, and it's revealed to them. So let's just take, for example, the Ten Commandments revealed to Moses, right, and there isn't any subjectivity, there isn't any um, disagreement with them. Is there? They've stood the test of time, and they're accepted. I don't think there are many language discrepancies with them. Thou shalt not murder is pretty
Well,
self-explanatory.
no, there is. Like, look at it like this: do not worship false idols is debated on.
Yeah.
People talk about whether "do not worship false idols" actually means do not pray to other gods, or no, is it do not, like, one of the big ones is do not use the Lord's name in vain.
Yeah.
Do not use the Lord's name in vain is debated on whether it means like cursing, or whether it means taking the Lord's name to war, as in using it as a battle standard to attack other religions, for example, or attack other beings. And so, like, even in terms of the Ten Commandments, even in terms of the most simplistic, most basic forms of rules, of deontological rules, there needs to be some level of reason. But that level of reason, even it is transcribed into the language itself. Like when I say "do not kill," that's because that command structure is based off the function of English as a language, of Latin, of Hebrew. It has the way that it places an object within the sentence is based within the language. But, like, for example, in Latin, it would have probably read more like, in a literal translation, "kill, do not," like,
Yeah.
and that would have been understood by the individuals in reference to how they understand reality. And that is the basis of how just reading itself is a rational function.
Yeah, I mean, I can accept that, but then I suppose that applies to all moral frameworks, doesn't it? And that, well,
Absolutely.
it applies to everything. But it still doesn't deter from the fact that people will subscribe to this moral framework, won't
It
they?
doesn't. No, it doesn't.
Yeah, and my point is that you can, for example, because what I think you're doing when you're referencing these human rights activists like feminists and socialists, you're presuming, aren't you, that they all have the same metaethical grounding and the same moral framework, but they don't necessarily, do they? Because there isn't a universal moral framework from which they operate. They all come in with there's difference of opinion there, isn't there? So some may be utilitarian, some may be theistic, some may be moral subjectivist, right?
Yeah, there
So
could be. I mean, the whole point of what I would be arguing, though, that the movements themselves, one, have specific functions separate from the individual, who are joining the movements. So, for example, like, to be a socialist, you cannot come into socialism believing, you cannot be a if you are advocating for socialism, you certainly cannot be a capitalist
yeah,
individualistically. Just as, and even if you were, like, socialism itself is not deterred by you being a capitalist. It has an objective separate from your interpretation of it, and it's like what socialism is understood between agents in relation to its overall overriding goal, and its purpose is to bring around an equality between individuals. And I think that is implicit within every single movement, equality movement that I mentioned, like feminism, racial civil rights, and socialism are all very much based upon fair treatment. Whether we debate the notion of fairness and what that means, fair enough. But fairness, ultimately, I would argue, is in relation to the equality between individuals, and I think that is usually the standard from which all of these are advocated for.
Yeah, well, okay, not necessarily, because let's say, for example, socialism may be. Now, obviously, I know socialism has its roots with Karl Marx and sort of anti-theism, but let's just say, for argument's sake, and you
Well,
do
you had the
find,
Catholic Workers' Party.
yeah, of course, yeah.
Jesus was a carpenter, you know.
Well,
Uh,
exactly. So you may get, isn't it, some socialists who ground their morality in theistic morality from Jesus. For example, love thy neighbor as thyself, right? Now that wouldn't be a necessary contradiction, therefore, for them to be a socialist grounding their morality there.
no,
But
I
their
mean Martin Luther King, I think, is a really
activism.
great example, isn't he? I think he was supposed to be a socialist Christian
Who-
and argued it from a theistic position.
Who's that? Sorry.
Martin Luther King.
Yeah, exactly. So would he be hypocritical, therefore, to be a non-vegan?
Yes.
Right. But why? Because he's arguing for human equality there, isn't he?
When he's arguing for human equality based off words in the Bible, which talks about loving thy neighbor, I would say that the definitions of love, neighbor, and so on, and the concept behind it are have to be held to the standard of reason. And if they're not, then they're nonsensical and can be open to the principle of explosion and cannot be prescribed. And since religion is actively trying to prescribe it as a command, it has to make logical sense.
Yeah, I mean,
Also, I mean, if you look, I mean, the main what philosopher for the Catholic Church for what, like, was it like 1,000, about 700 years now, has probably been Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, God-given reason.
yeah. Sorry, what was that? Thomas
Thomas
Aquinas.
Aquinas and believed that reason was God-given, and
Right.
that and argued for natural law, that nature itself allows us to understand what is good, bad, right, and wrong. I mean, if you look at it, the Bible hasn't got half of what Christians believe in it. That exists within the church, and it also exists in the mind of and the rational understanding of reality in the prescription of loving your neighbor. It doesn't say every occasion in which that occurs. So, like, how do you love your neighbor in this scenario? How do you apply these what are like fairly abstract rules to real life scenarios? These these come to you through reason. When you say, like, love thy neighbor, who is your neighbor? How do you love them? Is a very big part of what it means to be a Christian, and that has changed for the last 2,000 years over and over again. There used to be a time when you could love thy neighbor and yet be at war with them and kill people who were and justify it, like, you know, it's not a sin to kill an infidel, and that was justified. You've got later developments in terms of like who thy neighbor is and how loving them actually comes around. The whole point of these ethics being true and objective means that it must be rationally deducible anyway. Otherwise, there wouldn't be like, God hasn't prescribed. It's not actually true that God has given us ethics and it relates to, you know, the natural world. It must be somehow grounded within the natural world and discoverable through reason. And, you know, if it isn't discoverable through reason, or if it can be something irrational, then it wouldn't be objective anyway. So it needs to have that rational
Yeah,
basis. It will
not
always.
necessarily. Yeah, not necessarily. I would disagree with you there. I mean, discovering it through reason. I mean, reason and empiricism aren't the only forms of knowledge, right? Unless you're a logical, unless you're appealing to sort of logical positivism,
Well,
because
no, it's not logical positivism, is it?
well, I mean, if you're saying everything, you know, you can only discern these moral truths through reason, then I think it kind of is, because one could argue, no, you could intuit them, right? It could be revealed to you. You could have a sixth sense perception of them, right? So I don't know, because
I would say
it,
by what standard? Like, the thing is that, like, the main thing I would say is that, like, what knowledge is true justified belief. So you need to show that it is in existence and you have a valid justification for that. If you cannot show you have a valid justification for that, it's not knowledge.
Well, it's not knowledge according to current philosophical thought. I agree with you there. But if you go into spiritual philosophy, they will argue knowledge actually doesn't come through those means. Knowledge comes through revelation and intuition. Right? So it's just a difference of opinion there.
Well,
So
they can
I mean, I think
try
you can
and
make
make things up
it.
if they like, but then I would just say that like one of the big things is that like how they reconcile, like for example, differences of intuition. You know, that they end up in Moore's open-ended argument there. So, you know, good, what is it? Like the whole point of what you end up in is that everyone describing good as something different, even through Christian means, and all the Christians start fighting and arguing with each other because they can't agree what good is. And ultimately, or even like even the small tiny things of how to worship God in the best way possible, meanings of various passages within the Bible. Unless there's some sort of objective standard from which they agree that there is a conceptual foundation upon this, upon these deductions, we're just going to end up in the principle of explosion. That's just the way it
Yeah.
works.
Well, I mean, that's an issue for epistemologists. Now, I'm referring to the
That's an
ontology.
issue for theists.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would refer to the ontology of it, but and I would say that that is revealed in not just obviously Christian scriptures, but perhaps the world scriptures. So I appeal to something called spiritual philosophy with that, right? And the moral code uh, described by spiritual philosophy is very consistent, and consistent with all the theistic moral codes through the world. But I think
Here's the thing.
people would probably disagree with me there.
Oh,
But I think we're
Can you
digressing.
have intuitions that are not given by God, not
Sorry.
divinely? So could someone have an intuition which was divine, not divine revelation?
Yes.
And how
Yes.
would they understand the difference between what is divine revelation and not?
Well, they wouldn't. So for them, that would be true, right? Uh,
So you could say that, well, how would it be true? Because how do they know if it's true or not, whether it is divine revelation or not? Well, if they understand
well,
that that is
I
command
mean,
by God, how would they do that?
yeah, yeah. So I mean, I'm somewhat of an epistemological nihilist or a factual relativist. So, you know, so I think knowledge is subjective anyway, right? I don't think you can know anything, right? But there
Couldn't
is.
agree. I
Um,
couldn't disagree more. Sorry, but
so
that's for a different debate, I suppose.
that's right. Yeah, exactly. So I think we're probably going down a slippery slope there, right? But
Rabbit hole, isn't it?
yeah, so it's so I apply skepticism throughout, and I would say it's always subjective, but there is an objective set of rules as well. There is objective. There is an ontology, and that's revealed, and then people can come to know it. But you're right; they would only know it subjectively, and everybody would have a different take on it.
You're someone who maybe reads a lot of Schopenhauer.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
But I mean, my whole point would be that extreme skepticism itself relies upon normativity, and the skepticism itself is a relies upon one's reason being held to a standard that, and also relies upon like the ability to a certain methodology. That's where you get like the Cartesian method, you get the
Mhm.
Socratic method, and all of these different standards are ultimately either not true and skepticism doesn't exist, and in which case your ability to doubt knowledge doesn't exist, and so on. You can see where it kind of goes, and the kind of argument I would take, the kind of self-defeating nature of like extreme skepticism.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I suppose that's why Socrates said the only thing I know is that I know nothing, right? So
yeah, but I mean, it depends on what he meant by that. I mean, some people do think that he means that he knows nothing at all. Um, but I'm not so sure when I've read like a lot of these things. Like, well, I mean, read like a lot of Plato's dialogues with Socrates in the early dialogues. It seems like Socrates, when he's saying that, I think it could be talking about a paradox, but I think also it's an act of humility almost, and a point in which he's talking about being in a constant state of aporia,
Mhm.
and it's an
Yeah.
enlightenment. It's not a dogmatic view in the sense that it's not like an absurdity that
Mm.
is impossible to be overcame, because that's the whole point of the dialogues. The constant attempt to overcome is the journey of the philosopher.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ian.
No, no. That's an interesting, maybe a discussion for another time. I mean, it's obviously very interesting, but just to sort of come back to the issue we were discussing on sentientism, because
Mhm.
I suppose I'll come back to the point I made. There's no universal moral framework, is there, for these human rights movements such as anti-racism and feminism?
Oh,
Um,
I would absolutely say there was. I would say that the reasons for these movements and development is institutional, not individualistic. I think that the people who are subscribing to them are not the ones that one. I think that they are subscribing to them usually for the same purpose and with the same goal in mind, and that goal itself is a fact of reason. That the purpose, the telos of the organization, is in relation to the nature of humanity. And I think if you look at it, the best description of that position would be Aristotle.
Mhm. What you mean, like virtue ethics?
Well, I would say that, like, in terms of the understanding of institutions being the value of institutions being metaphysically in relation to human life. So, for example, the good of war is to, kill people, offer security and protection. Well, we would say the good of medicine is to heal people. Aristotle said that we could judge both in relation to human life and the city, and that city and its functioning, whether it's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. So if it could be internally inconsistent, like war could be overall bringing insecurity. If you're a warmongering nation and you're provoking attacks from various parties, then the function of war in your society isn't functioning properly. But overall, the reason that you're engaged in that activity in the first place is in reflection to a value, the value of human life. And that's what the good life for me is the good life for man. And the good life for man is we attempt to achieve the good life for man when we enter in these institutional formats. And that's what they are. They are rational endeavors to achieve a good life.
Right. Okay. So you think that every movement is based in that, is based in
Yes.
this institutional. Okay. So what would, let's say, for example, you take one of these movements, let's say feminism. How would you describe the moral framework, the grounding for that?
So I think feminism clearly, like throughout history, has been based from come from the being inspired by socialism a lot. Much of feminist philosophy began in socialist philosophy. I think that the suffrage movement and the Workers' Party, for example, were very close.
Mhm.
And the communists were very close. And I think the overall and overarching goal of suffrage and then later feminism and feminist philosophy has always been gender equality. Um, Whether it achieves that or not, and with its goals, and whether people actively, act in a feminist kind of way, quote unquote, is a different discussion. And I think overall, whether the philosophy itself has any underlying contradictions within the notion of patriarchy, for example, I'm not entirely convinced it adequately describes
Mhm.
reality. At the same time, I do accept that. Well, I would argue that for a more socialist understanding, that it's more plutocratic and matrixed. I think
Mhm.
power is far more complex and interwoven than I think feminism usually describes it as. But that doesn't mean that feminism is entirely wrong. I think those being, so for example, like the suffrage movement was brilliant.
Yeah.
Most feminist movements have actually been great. And I think feminism as a whole, like in terms of its organizational format throughout history, has been very much in relation to gender equality, equal pay, equal rights, trying to break down these walls that exist between genders, at least for
Right.
women anyway.
Yeah. So
Now,
I'm struggling to see how you
like,
make the jump from gender equality then to sentientism. I mean,
yeah,
what?
because I say that ultimately gender equality itself is based off an overriding goal to live a good life. And that's what we are all trying to do, live good lives. We're all trying to respect value of each other to overall increase the likelihood that we are going to live valuable lives, to live lives that are worth living, to achieve happiness, to achieve eudaimonia, and to flourish. And I think that, or what I would argue, is that when we look at something like feminism, what we see is a movement that is trying to achieve that by breaking down what it describes as prejudices, unjustified, unjustified, what would be the word, bias towards a single class of individuals for no other purpose than to either gain advantage for an individual. And so we have all of these movements relate to what I would call a master slave dynamic. the understanding of an individual who is being appreciated to a greater degree than another individual. It doesn't have to be like actually master slave in terms of hierarchical relationships. It just has to be it just has to show advantage or disadvantage to a single group of individuals, an individual or a group of individuals, without rational justification. And the only justification that can be given for equality in relation to how we should treat people has to be based within the nature of individuals. It has to be based into something that will not break Hume's law, something that can be shown to be true, justified belief. And the only thing that can, in that scenario, and the foundational basis of why equality is seen as a necessary format for a fair society, is in the experiences of individuals, in their value responses in the world. And so feminism itself is based off this notion of equality, which is undeniable because it talks about notions of fairness and social justice. And these notions of justice are overall in relation to reason and what the good life is for man, which is against respecting value simplicity.
Yeah, I know. I can understand what you're saying there, but the whole point is the equality is between human beings, between the genders, right? So I still struggle to see how you're making that jump from that to the equality between
equality itself is the foundation, not between genders. But equality between genders is an expression of equality.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So, I mean, coming back to something you said earlier, animals. I mean, I think you said animals have equal moral value. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I probably use ethical usually because I normally respect the distinction, but it doesn't really matter. Yeah, equal value,
Okay.
equal ethical consideration.
Equal ethical consideration, but do you see a difference between the moral value of humans and animals? For example, obviously, if you had the choice of saving a human child or saving saving a
Probably
drowning human
depends.
child or saving a drowning dog.
It
Is there a
depends on
distinction?
scenario. So, like for example, like I do respect. Like I would normally save a child before I save a dog. Usually not because I think that the child is more valuable, but because of the overall ramifications for one for not saving the child. Like you don't save the child, that family is going to be hurt. You don't save the child, and there are a plethora, a multitude of other, things going on. If we were to say in a vacuum, is the life of the child worth more than the dog? No. Is my life worth more than the life of a cow? No. Would I save myself over a cow? Yes. Is it a bias? Not necessarily. I think that you can have an obligation which respects value without it having to be applied like in this universal utilitarian standard. And I think that comes down to obligations and duties. Reason within an institutional format allows us to understand our obligations and duties to one another, which ultimately reflect how we behave in the world. I would say that my duty towards a drowning human child is greater than my duty towards a drowning dog. Typically because society has maybe anthropocentric ethics in one respect, but I think more so in the sense that for society to function properly, I probably have a greater obligation to those who are closest. So if it's like me cousin or something that's drowning or something like that, it's a greater obligation than a random stranger. That being said, I think that if society is just and fair, what we would see is that the dog, like people would actively try to save dogs. People try to save dogs from fires. I don't think there is a justification. Like if it's a random stranger and a random strange dog that I've now met, they have the same value to me. I don't think that you should be judged for saving a dog over a human in that scenario. If you are more likely to succeed in saving the dog than the human, and the likelihood of or let's say it's like better yet, let's say it's like a 70, 80-year-old human, and who's maybe got like a year or two left. Ultimately, and they're screaming, "It's okay, save the dog!"
Yeah. Let me go.
It's
Let me go.
interesting in terms of obligation.
Yeah. And I respect you for that view. I mean, it's a very interesting view to me. But would you agree with me that that's probably? I mean, it feels counterintuitive to me, and I think if you ask most people, right, they would feel a little bit uncomfortable with that conclusion, right? I think most people intuitively would say they intuitively value the human life more than the animal's life.
Yeah, I
Now
mean,
you can argue whether that's just sociocultural conditioning or whether it's
oh, absolutely would, because I mean, look at it like this: the Romans valued Romans; they did not value the people of Gaul. Does that mean that the people of Gaul didn't have value? Of course they did. They just used them to build their roads. Like the
Yeah.
reality is that there is a socio-cultural bias in our understanding of neighbor, for example, to love thy neighbor. That our understanding of each other is entirely tied into our cultural understandings of who has value in the first place. So people feeling
Yeah.
uncomfortable with the idea of saving a dog over a human, it's usually because they're already speciesist. Our whole society consumes animals, and our whole society sees like various species as being lesser and of less importance. We have an anthropocentric ethics, and we also have like anthrocentrism in terms of our understanding of reality. And I mean, there used to be a time when people actively thought that that the universe revolved around the world, and I'm not surprised at that at all. Um, the idea that the everything like we are the product of divine creation made in the image of God, and nothing is to of more value to us is just because to be honest, it's a byproduct of egoism and I think, to be honest, a prevalent narcissism that has been carrying on for thousands of years in terms of human worldview. People intuitively value themselves more, like accidentally even, and their interests more. And it's something that needs to be changed. I mean, even in terms of like our relations with other people, we're still having to break down these walls where we go like, look, you're not more valuable than anyone else. Everyone is of the same value.
Mhm.
And that has to be done even with people today. So am I surprised that like people will choose their race typically if they were to save like a black baby or a white baby and they're white or black, they're more likely probably I would say like you see the prejudice in the sense that it's a bias towards the race. Like they see themselves in that baby and they try and save themselves because they have this like inverted view of what is valuable. Because our understanding of what is valuable is in relation to ourselves. We feel value, we prescribe that upon other people's experiences. We prescribe a conscious experience upon another, and that is how we understand the world and how we understand the other itself as a reflection of our internal experiences. And that's the only way that we can do it in one respect, but it does lead many times to like
Yes, yeah,
egoism.
absolutely, and yeah, I can appreciate that. But essentially, this is, I mean, this boils down to being your opinion, right? It's just moral subjectivism, right? And if the majority of people don't share this view with you, they disagree. I mean, why? I mean, how are you going to argue that you're right and they're wrong? I mean, they would
The
just argue
reason
that they're right, isn't it? In seeing the
Well, they can
human being
argue. I mean, I'm
more.
happy to argue. I mean, I'm a philosopher. That's the job, isn't it? Like,
Yes.
um, it all ultimately has to come down to reason. And if at the end of the day, like in terms of having rational, justified beliefs, if you can't give a rational, justified belief and it's based purely off of prejudice, then I'm just going to say that you're full of it, and you have no reason to. It's an unjustified bias, which
Okay.
is a prejudice.
Fine. So it's going to come down to sentientism versus speciesism. But just before we get on to that, I'm guessing, are you familiar with the Richard?
Your sound is a bit echoey. I'm not hearing it. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Just the chat there. I just noticed the chat saying that the sound was echoey.
Oh, right.
Um,
Okay. Back a little bit.
listen, I can barely hear you. I'm gonna turn you up.
Okay.
I didn't realize it says you're coming through okay on here, but
Okay.
I'll turn you up just to make sure that if you speak now,
Yep. Is that okay?
is that okay, guys? In the chat, does that sound better? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to make sure that
No,
you're
that's
being
fine. Yeah.
heard a good degree. I'm enjoying the conversation though, and I hope everyone is enjoying it also.
Yep.
Um,
Likewise. Likewise. Right. So, okay to continue?
yeah, I think so. Just double check. Is that okay, guys? Apparently it's echoing a bit, but I think that might be your room. I'm not sure. I'll see if I can just play you through. I'm gonna have a quick listen. Um,
Let's check.
Apparently it's echoing a bit, but I think that might be
you're a little bit
like
like
your room.
echoey coming through the stream. I noticed. You're a little bit
Have a
echoey coming
quick
through with me
listen.
anyway, but just a tad.
Okay.
But for whatever reason, you're a little bit echoey in general. Should we try maybe
Right.
leaving and rejoining, just to
Right.
try and get
Yep.
uh,
Okay.
1 second.
You mean,
Sorry,
yep,
just
leave your stream or leave?
no, just the Discord. I think.
Yep. Okay. Yep. I'll come back. Give me just
Yeah,
1 minute then.
no problem. Sorry about this.
No, that's fine. Uh,
Right. Hopefully that will resolve it, guys. I hope you're all enjoying the stream, and I hope everyone in Arthuria is enjoying the debate. Yeah, and if anyone's interested, please go check out the Arthuria Discord server. It's about debates. You get a chance to debate a wide variety of topics. Really interesting, lovely people there, and great fun. So yeah, just check it out. If you can't hear him at all, that's probably because he's not here. But he'll be coming back.
Yeah, is that any better?
I think it's better. I think it's probably a bit better.
Okay,
But I think it's probably what we're gonna have to work with. So
yeah, fine. Okay. Yeah, so just picking up where we left off, I was just going to ask you about, are you familiar with the Richard Parker case in the late 1800s?
I'm not off the top of my head.
Right,
No.
so that was a case, you probably have heard of it, but I'll just, it was a case of that, there were a few men capsized on a boat, lost at sea. There was a cabin boy called Richard Parker.
Oh, yes, I'm actually, yeah, they ate him, yeah.
Yeah, they ate him, yeah. And do you have an opinion on whether that was right or wrong?
I think what they did was justifiable.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, I think that it's like moral responsibility again to oneself, the reflection of one's duties and obligations. They have an obligation of themselves before another. In that respect, not necessarily though. I mean, the captain could have sacrificed himself, which I think would have been admirable. Morally virtuous, but perhaps a little bit extreme to expect from someone. I don't think that you can expect someone to self-sacrifice, because usually it would deny their own subjectivity, which is essentially the basis of their mentor and ethics in the first place.
It's like moral responsibility again to oneself. The respect,
well, I think he was charged, and I think he was
obligation of themselves before another
with murder
in that respect.
Not
necessarily though. I mean,
they got let off, didn't they? I remember doing this because I did this in philosophy actually when I was at university. I'm pretty sure they got let off because the confessed. They put themselves forward. Yeah.
They were charged. I don't know what the actual outcome was. You're right. So they could have been let off. But the point is, I think the majority. Well, I think he was charged, and I think he was. I think they were charged. And feel that it was with murder in the end.
No. I think they got
cabin boy, right? Because they don't see the value of they don't see justification for it. But when they're asked if that was an animal like a dog, right? Most people would find that not morally reprehensible, right? They would find it fine. And I think that's the inherent distinction that most people have.
Yeah, but that's like you're appealing to their bias, aren't you? So like, people are prejudiced, and therefore prejudiced people make prejudiced decisions. That's all I get. So it's like a racist would not find it wrong to if it was black, if they sat there and they're like, oh well, it was a slave. They ate a slave. They chose to eat the slave before harming each other, like harming other like slavers. Then they would have been, oh, that's okay, that's understandable. You did the right thing. Well, they didn't do the right thing there, would they? It would be the wrong thing, and it would be a bad thing to do. In the same sense, it would be a wrong thing if it was anyone else.
Well, I can make that claim, appealing to theistic morality, but I'm not sure you can, because that's my point.
I can make that claim. Yeah.
Well, that's the point. That's sort of the argument I would put to you. I think it just comes down to majority rules. It's moral cultural relativism. It's moral subjectivism. But I don't see what moral.
Why would you think that morals were anything but objective? I think that the evidence points towards ethics being objective, that human behavior is being held to a standard of being justified or unjustified in relation to its capacity to bring around the function of man. Like when we act in a way that, well, when we act in general, our behaviors in general are in relation to try and bring around positive and negative, or bring around positive experiences and avoid negative experiences, even in a quote unquote egoistical way. And the foundations of egoism, even before we even move on to the fact that egoism entails altruism, I'd say that the foundations of egoism are objective. So there is no foundation. I don't think that. I don't think there is any justification in arguing that ethics is subjective, unless you've got a good argument there.
I think I would argue that that ethics is subjective.
So how would you go around doing it? And we'll see if we can kind of iron that out, and hopefully that'll lead you to the right place.
My take is that you can only really have objective morality if you have a moral authority, right? It's sort of like a William Lane Craig argument that otherwise everything is just your opinion. It just boils down to moral subjectivism,
Does
right?
it?
And I mean, you appealed actually there to creating a moral objective morality based on people's behavior, but that's sort of going about in a roundabout way, isn't it? And again, that will lead you to moral cultural relativism.
Does it? I mean, really, like when I look at it like this, like there is a nature of humanity in the sense that there's a function from which humanity undergoes. That like, no one can deny the positive and negative experiences of subjectivity. That's what it means to be a subjective agent. That they value the positives and disvalue the negatives. That's the
Yeah, so
basis
it's
of being a sentient being. I think that like that undeniable truth is in relation to our behaviors. We cannot deny that when we act, we are doing it to bring around some supposed good. The whole point is that whether our actions are actually likely to bring around that good or not, and whether the behaviors themselves are justified or unjustified, and how we understand that. So what I would say is how we understand that is in relation to the notions of value and evaluation, which exist between multiple agents, and allows us to construct rules and rule-based systems which govern our behaviors to avoid making categorical errors. Now, the only way that we can avoid doing that is by having universals which ultimately describe and metaphysically divest aspects of our experience from one another, which allows me to and relate one another to each other. For example, I can understand that I do not want cancer. I've seen people suffer from cancer. I've seen that cancer ultimately is a negative experience. Okay, now how do I avoid getting cancer? One good thing would be not to smoke. I've seen that smoking causes in humans, like through observation, and relation to myself, smoking typically causes cancer. Not always, but typically. And so, if I wish to avoid having cancer, I should avoid smoking. And I happen to always think that it would be just think this, but it is rational to avoid negatives. You cannot desire a negative. Like it actually is a contradiction. Like to want to desire to desire that which is inherently undesirable makes no sense. You can be deluded and make mistakes. Like you can you can be crazy, for example. But ultimately, when we talk about like positive and negatives, we can't actually desire a negative. It doesn't fundamentally. It's a fundamental impossibility to desire something which is undesirable. And we cannot help but desire that thing which is desirable. And so my understanding would be to find out what is desirable, what is the action which ultimately would bring around the most desirable outcome. And to do that, I need to relate myself and others. I need to respect their ability to validate and falsify my positions. And ultimately, I need to understand what it is in reality that I am trying to respect. And the only thing that I can boil that down to, and what it must boil down to, is experience itself, value itself. Now, to understand my experiences and my values, I need to understand yours and your ability to as common property. Because if it's not common, then language doesn't function, and I can't apply reason. So what I have to understand is value simpliciter, the relationship between individuals themselves, subjectivity simpliciter. And so once I get to that point, then it's an objective system based on nature. That is like essentially Aristotelian or Hegelian.
Well, well, that's presuming that we all have the same goals, right? We all
Hello?
have the same values, right? But there are people may value completely different things to you. People may value murder. People may value
If you're
death.
talking, I can't hear
People may
you.
value
Can
suffering.
anyone else hear him?
Oh, sorry. Have you lost me?
Can anyone hear me? Can the chat hear me?
I can hear both of you.
Because
Right,
I can't hear the debate opponent right now.
Still
So
here.
yeah, if you could just fire into the chat.
Yeah. Still speaking. I think. Yeah, people can hear me, I think. You can't.
You can hear me, okay, but you can't hear the opponent here, Jiva.
Yeah. I'm still here.
Anyone else? One second, let's see. All right, you can hear me and Jiva. All right, okay, I can't hear Jiva. I'll try leaving and joining again. Hello?
Yep, can you hear me
Oh,
now?
I can hear you now. There we go. Sorry about that, guys.
That's all right, no problem. So I think I was just saying, shall I just pick up from where I left off?
Yeah, go for it, man.
All right, you can hear me.
Yeah, so I was saying I think that still
Jiva.
comes down to
Oh,
more
right. Okay, I can't hear Jiva. I'll try
subjectivism,
leaving
right?
and joining
Because
again.
different, you're presuming that people have the same objective goals and values as you do, but they may not, right? Somebody may,
Hello?
a culture or an individual may,
can you hear me now?
may value murder, death, pain, suffering, right?
That's all right, no
So,
problem.
and if that's the case, then you don't have.
So I think I was just saying,
to agree upon, do you?
Well, actually, I would say that one, you can have individualistic values, quote unquote, when what you're really doing is saying that this X is good, X is bad, and you're presupposing a notion of value. That would be subjective. But in the words of Aristotle, it doesn't matter where you start, it matters where you end. The function, the purpose of this is to bring around the positive or negative, bring around a positive or avoid a negative experience. Undeniably, that they are desiring something that is desirable, and they are wishing to avoid something which is undesirable. They just haven't worked out what it is yet. If they are desiring something which is ultimately a negative for them, then I would say that they are either mistaken or mentally ill.
Not necessarily. I mean, for example, in the Mahabharata episode of in Hindu philosophy, you know, Queen Kunti, she asks Krishna, she says to him, please give me more trials and more tribulations in life, give me more pain and more suffering, right? So that was her desire. She wanted that, right? And
Yeah,
there
but
is
there
a
would have been an
spiritual
overall purpose. There would have been an overall purpose for that pain. Like in the words of Nietzsche, like the problem isn't suffering, the problem is meaningless suffering. But when we look at what are the foundation of like, and he says that humans have no problem with suffering, they have a problem with meaningless suffering. It's like, for example, Jesus being nailed to the cross, right? The purpose was, you know, the salvation of humanity, you know, in the theistic mindset. That was a meaningful suffering. The desire for penance, the desire for all of these different acts of what would be harmful actions usually comes with a greater overall goal, which is to create a bigger positive. Like they take negative now to avoid positive. They take negative now to ensure positive later. You know, the act of withholding oneself and one's desires to a standard so that they could get into heaven, for example, or ultimately it comes down to living like achieving the best experience for the individual, for it to be motivating in the first place. Otherwise, it wouldn't have a motivating, urging relation to the world. Like the individual desires something which is ultimately something that is valuable to their experiences. And that value is not something they choose. It's something that's given to them by nature. Like I can't choose to, you know, like being set on fire.
Yeah, but even if I accept that and concede that, right, which I'm not necessarily doing, but it still doesn't get you to a common objective goal. Well, it gets you to a common objective goal in the sense that everybody wants what they want, but that's just a tautology, really, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't get you to anything practically objective.
See, but I would say that everyone wants the good experience. Everybody wants
but if
the
everybody's
positive
definition
experience.
of good experience is different,
Oh,
then what
yeah, but that
value
definition
does
can be different, but it's what it's in relation to. Like, what is the foundation of our experience? How do we understand what brings around this positive experience? And I'd say that understanding about our desires and our overall experiences relate to something that is common. And the only thing that can be common between us is this ability to evaluate, which is natural, which is exists within ourselves, within our function, within our natures.
Yeah, so for you, for example, what brings you the good, what brings you good is being a vegan. But let's say for your next door neighbor, what brings him good is eating meat, and
Well,
you're
it
both
depends.
fulfilling your subjective desires there, aren't you?
It's not just about one. Well, as I say, like it has to be an understanding of what is common between. It's not just about me and what brings me quote unquote good and positive experiences. It's about reflection of positive experience in general. Because otherwise, I would be creating a master-slave dynamic, as I've said before, and I would be presupposing what is good for me rather than having it evaluated objectively. It has to be something objective from what I believe is good. It has to be something which is overall good. And universally the case. So I have to. It's like what Hegel says. I think it's like the universal. The individual finds himself in the universal. The particular finds himself in the universal in that respect. You know, it's hermeneutic. I would also say that, like, for example, what brings let's say my neighbor hates being vegan, right? And I love it. Doesn't matter. Like the overall reason to be vegan is to respect value, and you are still respecting that neighbor is still respecting value to a greater degree. than if they were to not be vegan, which means they are doing the more rational decision in order to bring themselves the better experiences. Because otherwise, they're just presupposing that they will gain a better experience from eating meat. Then they ultimately are open to the principle of explosion again.
Sorry, could you just repeat that? I lost you. I lost you halfway through that.
I'm saying, like, unless it was an objective standard, they would be open to the principle of explosion, which means that they would be presupposing what was good for them, which is ultimately makes ethics impossible anyway. So the whole point is that, like, if they are not being held to what is a standard, which is separate from what they are presupposing as good for them, then it has to respect value itself, and it's about respecting value itself and subjectivity itself. So if it is that way, which I would argue it is, then even if they're dissatisfied, it's better to be dissatisfied than, well, in the words of John Stuart Mill, better to be better to be a man dissatisfied. What was it? Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Better to be a man dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. You know, and I think that's the actual reality of it. There are rational foundations for our actions, and if we do not apply them, then we have what we're doing is we're playing ethical roulette.
Well, I would just argue, according to John Stuart Mill, I mean, that's not a fact of nature, is it? That's his opinion.
But John Stuart Mill. Well, actually, I would say it is a fact of nature. I think that, like, it's John Stuart Mill's relating that to what he calls higher pleasures in the relationship between individuals and positive and negative experience, and I think it's foundationally right. And it wasn't even his idea, really. Like, he got that from, and he even said that, like, utilitarianism began in Socrates. I mean, I don't think they're utilitarian, but he says utilitarianism began in Socrates, with Socrates and Gorgias, I think he said, was the foundation. And that's where he talks heavily about the idea of it's better to be the man being punished than the man. It's better to be someone who is punished for a crime than to be a man committing a crime. So it's like better to be like someone like being tortured than to be the man torturing someone unjustly.
But I still don't see how he can justify it or how he can ground that claim. That's the point.
Well, I mean, if you read Gorgias, I think he does a pretty good job. I think the whole point of grounding it is to say that there is nothing more that we can. What we can say is that the person being tortured, that chooses to be tortured, if it's like, for example, like the person who has the bad experience, maybe having a bad experience in terms of it's ultimately a negative, and they can understand that. But the person who is a fool and a tyrant, they can never act within their own interests because they don't have any reasons for acting. So ethically, one has ethical reasons and one doesn't, and it's always better to have ethical reasons if you are trying to achieve what is positive, because otherwise you are baseless and groundless.
Yeah, and why does that matter? I mean, why should that matter?
Well, I'd say that it inherently matters to that individual. They cannot help, like in the words of Aristotle, all men desire to know. Knowledge itself is necessary to gain anything. The fact that we behave in the world, like when I go to take a drink, for example, I'm doing that based off knowledge and experience that it will quench my thirst, that it will ultimately allow me to alleviate like a pain response, which is thirst, and also maybe bring me pleasure and satisfaction. That itself is based off an understanding of reality, which is grounded within reason. And all of these different actions and all of our attempts to bring around positives in when I desire an outcome is ultimately based off reasons. We cannot undo that. Like we cannot help but like act within relation to what we want to achieve and the means to achieve it.
Yeah, I would push back there and say not necessarily and not everything. For example, a 2-year-old child who just suckles at his mother's nipple, isn't it, for milk, doesn't necessarily reason his way to that decision, right? The same way that many animals have an instinctive response to avoid danger. That's not necessarily a process of reasoning, is it? So many of our
No, but then animals also put themselves in scenarios which we wouldn't as rational beings. And we would say, well, that animal would have been better off if it hadn't have done that. And I think that the whole thing is that when you see that instinctive response, all we're pointing towards is a lack of like self-awareness. It's not that it's not that they would not have been better if they were able to apply reason. It's not as if there isn't a form of and as well there's a lack of free will there anyway. Like a lot of the instinctual, there's no self-determination. Like they're not choosing to behave that way; they are simply behaving in the world.
Yeah, naturally. So I think that's a good segue actually into the sentientism issue, because I do want to just touch on that briefly. So, in your view, do you subscribe to a sort of sentience hierarchy amongst
No,
species?
no, I think it's nonsense. I think that the idea of differentiating an individual's experiences based upon what you believe their conscious value is worth is usually based on a bias. Like I do not understand. Like what I can say is I can make rough comparisons between a being's like desires in terms of like if it's resisting a great deal, I can see that it's something highly unpleasant for that being typically. And I can say the same with the human. Like, so for example, if a human is like being tortured and trying to get away, or they're flinching in pain and they're trying to avoid something hurting them, typically that human does not want that thing to occur, and I'm justified in arguing that case. Now, with an animal, I would say it's the same in terms I can make rough comparisons between the desires of how more or less the value responses to it. Now, the greater the resistance or the greater the approval, typically the greater the positive or negative of that particular evaluation by the animal. However, the overall conscious evaluative process, like how much value is actually being processed within the mind of the creature,
Mhm.
something that is absolutely unobtainable, even between individuals. It comes down to the hard problem of consciousness. So, like, I don't know how much my dog likes going out for a walk. I don't know whether it's equatable to me, having a nice time, or if I don't know if it's far, far greater. What I can say is that based off treating it the same as mine, because that's the only thing I can say, and the only justification, the only relationship I have in comparison to consciousness is based off my own comparison. That conscious beings, typically, when they have positive or negative responses to a greater degree, evaluate things in more or less a similar way. And that's kind of what we're forced into. There is no real getting over that, unless we're just in like, we could just presuppose, for example, that everyone has a much different response. Like nobody feels pain, so when I exploit them, like reality is that they're not really feeling pain to the same degree I am, and that's just entirely subjective. The only grounding that we have is to presuppose that all conscious subjective experience is equal.
Well, I suppose the difference is that the humans can communicate through language, can't they? Their distress
But
or their pleasure, whereas an
for
animal
what
can't. You have to presume it, like you said, through reasonable inference. You can use body language and
No, it's not
um,
even just that. Like, what is the basis of language if it wasn't for within nature anyway, and its relationship between metaphysically like individuals? Like, I can't again access an individual's mind itself. I have to rely upon words being applied to that being's mind, from which is like which I hold common. Like we all have the concept of a mind, which we hold common, but I can never access your mind and you cannot access my mind. I'm just relying upon a value of words.
true.
I'm never going to actually obtain that information firsthand.
Yeah, no, true. I can see that, but that is significantly different from what you can get from the animal, though, isn't it?
I don't think so, and I think Levinas makes that point accidentally. I don't think he's arguing for animals. What he calls is the first what he calls the primordial expression is the first relationship between ethics. It is the fact that you are like, for example, if someone is smiling and looking at you and saying, "I am in great pain," and they're having and they seem happy and delighted, and they're like, I am in so much pain. There usually is a contradiction there. We can see that, well, wait a minute, I don't think you are in pain. Or you think, why aren't you showing the pain? Is there something behind this? Like there's something going wrong here. There's something strange happening. Because ultimately, we would say that pain responses are related to what we can perceive in reality. We can see that something is in pain or something is not in pain. I mean, overall, now we've got even greater mechanisms. Now we'll understand the material nature and the cause of pain. Then, to a certain degree, anyway, we can actually measure if a being is having a pain response. So,
Mhm.
like overall, like we have no reason to deny
Yeah.
the pain responses of an animal just because they're non-linguistic. Otherwise, we should do the same as well. Like we call it in marginal cases, and I would happen to agree that we would be justified in doing it to disabled people or non-linguistic, like autistics, for example.
hmm hmm Yeah, okay. I mean, I would push back there and just say, on a practical level, I think we do rely more on language than on facial reactions to understand, to understand what people are feeling, or or what they want to express. But you are right, there are marginal cases with people who can't communicate, disabled
Well,
people.
remember, it's a bit different as well. Like, look at it like this: there's a language game involved with people as well. So, like, our ability to understand what people are communicating is again based off something else, which is not grounded within the language. It's like we're not. It's like if I was to say that I would say one the understanding of words is conceptually applied to reality itself, and that our ability to understand words implies the possibility that they're actually obtaining. But more than that, I would say that like look like if someone says like a very famous I think example is like a doctor asking a patient like what's your pain out of 10, right? And they go 7, 10, 5. It's like I have no idea what that means. What does it mean to feel 5 pain? Now what I can say is that usually that points to me like they're evaluating their pain to a higher or lesser degree. Now I can gain that same information typically from their resistance. It implicitly shows like if that person is like like got a pain and it's trying to avoid it, or if it's showing great distress, it's exactly the same, communicating the exact same information, just in a different format.
But the issue is we're limiting this to physical pain, right? But I suppose, would you agree with me in saying that a large part of pain is mental pain, mental
Yeah,
anguish?
absolutely. But I would also say that dealing with physical pain, for example, is also eased by your ability to have maturity and an understanding of your environment. But you also have like, like for example, even being self-aware in the sense of being able to understand one's own emotions and anxiety, like being able to bring your anxiety levels down is even being able to regulate your emotional pain through self-awareness. Like therapy's a great example, but even self-therapies like meditation and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So just I just want to go back to one thing you said about the sentience hierarchy. You don't subscribe to any sort of sentience hierarchy, but presumably you have to, don't you? Because you are eating some organisms and not others, right? Some species and not others. So
There's no evidence to say that plants have any form of sentience.
Right. Okay. But what insects, invertebrates?
Insects, yeah. I'd say that there is evidence definitely to say that they're sentient.
Okay. So you would
I
draw the line.
don't eat them.
Yeah.
I do try, and as far as possible, I do try and minimize harm caused to insects. I don't deliberately step on like ants
Okay.
or anything like that.
So do you
Ultimately, but like let's like look at it, the whole point of like if you had to eat the cabin boy, are you justified? Yeah, you do have to eat something, and you have to eat plants. Like you don't have to eat animals, but you do have to eat plants. So there
Well,
is
you don't have to eat plants, do you? You can be a fruitarian, for example. You can live off the
oh,
products of
that's a plant. That is a plant, man.
No, but you're not eating the tree, are you? You're eating the apple that falls to the ground from the tree. The tree continues to live. The apple isn't a sentient organism, is it?
But neither's the tree.
Sorry?
But neither's the tree.
Well, okay, that's debatable. You're right. Okay, but I think some people would say it is because otherwise, where are you positioning this mind? I mean, are you this sentience comes from?
I
Are
would
you,
say
for
that
example,
we've got
are you?
two foundations. I'd say that ultimately the foundation for knowledge for one is behaviorism. Our relation to one another would have had to have been founded on behavior and our capacity to use language, again, behavior, so that we can point towards things in reality. The whole Wittgensteinian, that's a slab, and just say slab, and the indication that it relates to some sort of ontological object is in between behaviors before it's ever even linguistic. Because language hadn't developed yet. So like there has to be some form of behaviorism for epistemology as a whole as a foundation,
Okay.
and the presumption that another mind exists in that respect at that point. And then I would say, in terms of materialism, I would say that like what we've found is that mind is typically related to material. What we've seen is that these behaviors and these functions are ultimately in direct relation to material causes, such as a brain, which has shown that it is neurological. And what we can say is that someone for example, that has brain damage, it changes. They even report that it changes the way they think, the way that they perceive the world, or which shows that like there is a material cause in relation to mind.
Okay. So can I just come back? Can I just
Yeah.
quickly before you move on, just come back to a couple of points? So you mentioned, you wouldn't deliberately step on insects, which I think is credible. Yeah, respect you for that. But would you do you sweep the floor in front of you when you walk?
I don't. But I think that I don't think it'll do very much good. I think sweeping the floor is probably going to kill them anyway. But I think that overall, I think that there are reasonable and reasonable risks to take and not. Like, for example, do I drive a car, and if the chances of hitting a human on the road is not absolutely negligible. Like, you can end up in a car crash, you can end up knocking people over, but I'd say that risk is justifiable.
It's not a certainty, is it? Whereas it is a certainty that you will kill multiple insects in driving a car.
It's not a certainty, no, but then in terms of again, what is reasonable for someone to be expected to do or even able to do. Like, for example, if you don't drive a car these days, typically you're probably not going to be able to get to work, and you're going to have to take some form of transport. So, like, the reality is you're supposed to levitate there. And if you don't work, you don't eat. There is a respect of your freedom and your subjectivity which is coming into play.
Yeah, but my point is, you're not subscribing to a sentience hierarchy. In which case, I presume you consider the moral value and of an ant or a spider the same as that of a pig or a cow, right? In which case, could one argue that it would be hypocritical for a vegan not to use a car, to use any form of transport to get around?
No. So, say, for example, I would for example, if I in the trolley problem, if I was to pick what side I was going to have to hit, and one had my mom on it and one had somebody else's mom, I'm going to have to hit the other person's mom. Doesn't mean that I have less value. It just means that I have a greater obligation to my mom. I have an obligation to myself in terms of my ability to live my life, in terms of not only just a decent way, but more in the sense that it's what is a minimum standard in terms of being able to eat, for example. Like, you need to go to work and so on. I think that you should try and minimize this as much as possible, minimize harm as much as possible. But I don't know many people who are moral paragons in the sense that they're able to absolutely avoid all forms of exploitation in every way possible. But at the same time, I think there are reasonable requests, and not eating meat, for example, is not only easily achievable whilst living a positive life for the average everyday individual, but it also usually means that you're healthier. And I'd say that giving up something like transport and work and so on like that is a much greater cost to a life, and what would be like a decent standard of living as well than giving up meat. But even if it wasn't, I do think that meat directly causes more harm, and I can argue that massively. So meat is directly tied to global warming. Meat is directly tied to deforestation. Meat, dairy and eggs are directly tied to deforestation, global warming, ocean dead zones, and that's just environmental. The killing of 70 billion animals a year, trillions of fish. The harm done by the meat, dairy, and egg industries is much greater than the transport industry.
Well, yeah, I respect that, but that is a different argument. For example, I did say at the start that I think you can make a reasonable arguments for veganism based on the environment, nutrition, but that's moving away from the sentience argument, isn't it?
No, well, not necessarily, because why do we care about the forests anyway? Why do I care about the environment? I remember talking about this in back when I was doing environmental philosophy, and my classmates thought I was absolutely mental. But because I said that I would rather, if there was a planet that had entirely vegetation on it, non-sentient, just plants, like a forest, beautiful, unbelievable, better to absolutely annihilate that entire planet than kill one animal.
I could see why you had some pushback for that.
Yeah, they believed that there was inherent aesthetic value, and that aesthetic value mattered, and and then eventually, actually, most of them started coming around. By the end of it, I had argued 3 people round. By the end of it was finished, there was a Chinese guy that was there as well, and he was I think he was Chinese or just Asian. I'm not actually sure. I'm not sure, but he started off on their side, and then ended up reading Peter Singer and swapping. There was another one that agreed that the forest, he thought the forest had value in itself, but that moral value was then greater in terms of sentient life always must overtake aesthetic value, and so on like that. So they ended up arguing quite a few of them around.
Okay, no, well done. Look, I'm sorry, but I've got to actually wrap this up now. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. I really appreciate the debate.
Yeah, no, me too. I've enjoyed it, and I think you've certainly given me some yeah, something to think about. And yeah, it's been very enjoyable.
No, thank you very much. And you've given me a nice what would be the word, like interrogation in terms of like really like making us think about my positions and evaluate my position.
Yeah.
And I will say, shall we make closing statements? And
Yeah. Carry on.
do you want me to go first, or would you like to go first? It's up to you.
I really don't mind, whatever you prefer.
No, I'll go first. So I'd say that ultimately my argument in this debate has primarily been that the foundation for all equality movements is based upon a notion of the other being equal. That notion of otherness, equality, fairness, justice are objective and based in our understanding of conscious subjectivity, which is overall present in animals as it is in humans. So anthropocentrism is not a justifiable excuse for dismissing non-human animals and their interests. What I would say ultimately is that if you are respecting equality and you were to understand equality correctly, you would see that veganism and sentientism is inherently entailed, and that we must value animals as having equal consideration to ourselves. So yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I would just conclude by saying that I think perspective philosophy has given a very good account of in support of his proposition, but I still think he's assuming the meta-ethical grounding and moral framework for all human rights activists, and in doing this, he's claiming that this is a universal law, or this is universal, sorry, when we know that it isn't. Individuals from these groups will have different moral frameworks. Some may be utilitarian, some may be subjectivist or theistic, and their moral frameworks may not necessarily lead to veganism. And I think he would agree with me that most human rights activists are not vegan. I'm sorry, I never actually got to ask you that question during the discussion. But consequently, I think we can infer that the most of them do not see veganism as a moral obligation. And I think this just boils down to a difference in opinion. I think it's just his opinion against theirs. And in moral subjectivism, I think the majority rules. So I think his argument does fail there. And I think I'll leave it there.